My name is Linda Duke. I'm the director here at the Beach Museum of Art, and I'm so pleased to see this wonderful crowd. I think we have a real treat in store for us this evening, and the crowd is a little bit challenging for the capacity of our room. We have actually put out every extra chair at this point, so I'm terribly sorry about that, and I hope those of you who are standing can find a comfortable place. There are a few scattered empty spots. I see one there. Does anyone else have an empty seat next to them? Raise your hand. People will be very glad to let you step over them to get to an empty seat. When Margo Kren and I were talking about how she might be introduced this evening, she let me know that she wanted to give me quite a lot of latitude. She wasn't interested in having me read off all of her resume heights and achievements. So she allowed me to handle this the way I want to, and so it will be a little unusual, but I hope you'll bear with me. When Margo turned in her artist statement to us so that we could print it on the card that many of you received in the mail, and I went around and scattered a few of these on seats in the room, so if you haven't seen it and there's not one on your chair, maybe your neighbor has one, and we have more out at the desk. But when I read her statement, I was really taken aback by one phrase in it, and I'm going to read that to you. She wrote, "Things I have allowed to be of significance are lodged somewhere in the work." And what really struck me about that is that I studied Chinese painting in graduate school. And I'm not aware of that term, something about anything being lodged in an artwork. I'm not aware of that being a very commonly used term when we talk about art in English, but it's a very often used term when translators are rendering Chinese texts about art into English, because Chinese artists used that thought, that meaning that we translate as lodged, quite a lot. And it really rang true to me in thinking about Margo's work. And so if you'll bear with me for a minute, I want to read an opening paragraph out of a really wonderful book called Remembrances. It's by a scholar of Chinese literature named Stephen Owen. And Stephen is writing here about Chinese literature, classical literature, but what he says is equally true about Chinese visual art. He wrote, "Classical Chinese literature made a promise early in its history that it would be a means to perpetuate the self of the good writer. Such promises of literary immortality are, of course, not unfamiliar in Western tradition, but through its long history, the Chinese tradition increasingly stressed a grand and quixotic qualification of that promise. It would transmit not simply the name, but the very content of the self, so that the later born might truly know the person by reading the work. It was a promise fraught with anxieties and difficulties in proportion to the powerful hopes it raised." And so what I want to suggest here is that, as Margo has noted in talking to many of us and in her artist statement, her work looks lots of different ways. She's painted in different styles, with different materials. She's made prints and paintings. She's done things that are naturalistic and things that are abstract. But to me, there is something lodged in all of that work that feels very essentially Margo Kren. And I think that's quite interesting. I don't think every artist achieves that. And so I wanted to share that with you tonight because I think it's one of the most remarkable things about her work. And now she's here to tell us about her work as an artist. So please welcome Margo Kren.
Thank you, Linda, and thanks to all of you for coming here this evening. At this time, I'd especially like to thank a few people who have encouraged and assisted me in preparation of my presentation. The director of the Beach Museum, Linda Duke, who has given generous, supportive comments and the kind invitation to speak. John Bloom. Is John here? Where's John? Right, stand up. Yes, please. Yeah, that's John. He photographed the works. He's very good. A gifted photographer who has photographed my work in collaboration with his amazing camera, who has exposed the brilliant color and clear lines of the artworks that I had not originally seen in my work. Don Morozak, you, up. No, up. Not everybody. Thank you. A careful reader, the best critic of my writings, who has brought clarity and ease to the readership of my ideas. Larry Robertson, there you go. Please. An expert, knowledgeable in all things about computers, being the great, patient teacher that he is, he has helped me learn for the first time about PowerPoint and what it could do. Supported by these four individuals, I do not stand up here alone. I don't know that we heard it, but I want to say that, add that as I work in my studio, I listen to music, mostly jazz and the blues, and that was playing the whole time that you were here, but that's okay, another time. Yeah, but it's one of my favorites, jazz man Eric Dolphy. And thanks to Luke Dempsey for setting that up. Okay. In the last 45 years, I've changed directions repeatedly, moving from realism to abstraction, moving from one style to the next. But there has been a consistency to my vision. I've always wanted my viewers to engage with the world at large. Apocalyptic themes through to bad girl humor. It is only recently that I've become conscious of who I am as an artist. Basically, my work is a record of where my travels and day-to-day explorations have taken me as a person. Those things I've allowed to be of significance are large somewhere in my work. In all my experimentation in various media, I have let the concept determine which media need to be used. For example, a landscape, just by itself, determines less than my response to it does. And every device I can bring to the work, from unexpected size to crude handling of the paint, and perversely an unrealistic palette, is dedicated to emphasizing that fact. I selected this particular image to demonstrate how important drawing is for me. The corner. Drawing helps me to keep in touch with the practice of observing closely. Within a complex, realistic work, there can be parts that are almost unnoticeable at first. It's right here. If you didn't see this, but just that section, it could just pass as abstract. But when they are isolated and observed, they show themselves to be quite abstract. I isolated this small section, a section that can easily pass as abstract if one is not aware of the rest of the drawing. Realism and abstraction are easily transferable for me. There's no hard, fast rule exactly where one starts and the other begins. And I like it when a work ends up, as much as possible, right between realism and abstraction. In the far right of this image are In the far right of this image are markups, ideas for 2 9-foot-tall hard-edge paintings. Right here. 2 of the tall red, black, white works are meant to be exhibited 18 inches apart. These are titled Female, right here, and the other 2 are Male, right here. At first they appear abstract, but on closer observation, one can see them as having male and female characteristics. A photo of my large painting rack is included on the far left to give a sense of the scale of these large paintings. In the photograph above, I stand in to provide a measure of scale to the large paintings. These works are all called untitled, plus the year completed. They are so abstract, they relate only unto themselves. They are self-referential. I wanted to go as far as I could with these works until there was no personal expression at all going on there. The impersonal is what becomes personalized. This drawing is my first serious work, a silver point drawing. And it was completed 5 years after I had married my husband, George. I now claim this drawing to contain all that I would later do as an artist. A professor in the Department of Grain Science and Industry on the Kansas State University campus gave me a copy of a photo chart of bread drawings, bread studies, taken by one of his students. The photograph shows 12 slices of bread. There are ways to adjust the behavior of bread by the adjustment of the amount of sugar, water, fat, salt, dough, conditioners, emulsifiers, and by changing the gluten level. In no time, as I drew each slice of bread, it began to appear to me as a human, and taken together, they are all like people lined up for inspection. Identified them as Jewish prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. I began to think of the needless, harmless practices of the Nazi doctors and their surgical excesses. These breads were victims of such crimes, or so I thought. I prefer the delicacy of the silver point line in combination to something so opposite to the horrors of the subject matter. My husband had escaped with his parents from Austria in 1939. As an adult, he became a professor of Holocaust studies and European thought in the history department at the Kansas State University. I learned much about the Holocaust. My drawing is much more than a reflection of my domestic and personal life. It is baking bread for my husband. It affords a glimpse into my political, global concerns. I offer this up as my way of seeing things, not just as one way among many. Not all ways of seeing are right. As you look at these 2 photographs, ask yourself, are they the same person? They are the same person, just 5 years apart. The body language says it all. This is also true of the kind of work I was doing at the time. Perhaps like some of my early works, the photograph on the left, taken in 1969, is rather cold and standoffish, with utterly blank face compared to the more relaxed photo on the right, which was taken in 1976 when I was working on the drawings of bread. This work is part of a series of Prismatic pencil drawings titled Dreams and Memories, done in 1979. I was a year out of graduate school at the University of Iowa City, where I completed my MFA degree. The image demonstrates how my work was continuing to become more openly personal. The title of this work is Dos Madres, 2 mothers. As a child, I watched my mother survive her many bipolar mood swings. I felt that I had 2 mothers. There were times when her sadness would leave her and she could look quite happy. A child could easily identify the stepmother in the fairy tale as the angry mother, and this explains away situations by letting one think, if my real mother were here, she would be happy. As a child, I was given boots to wear every day to help strengthen my legs so that my knees would not turn inward. Working from memory of this experience, I portrayed my mother as a fairy godmother as she assists me with my boots. She cares about me. The fairy godmother in the story actually acts the way one might wish one's real-life mother would act. At the top of this drawing, I ride my beloved horse, Ginger. My brother rides with me on his horse. My sister has no horse of her own. My most happy times as a child were these carefree rides out on the levees, through the citrus orchards outside the small town of McAllen, Texas. The lower portion of the drawing demonstrates how heavily I was influenced by a comic strip created by a German immigrant in America in 1897, Katsuyama Kids. The children's book titled Stubenpeter was published first in 1845. Adults read these stories of the early 1940s to their children, warning them that they would be punished if they did not behave. In Stubenpeter, the bad boy Suck-a-Thumb has his thumbs cut off with large scissors and is shown in the left corner. I portrayed Snow White with all her goodness gone. She has evolved to show all the cunning of a very clever cat. She punishes the once sweet, now naughty boys, the 7 dwarfs. Their heads are cut off. In this charcoal drawing of the hallway in my house, the viewer can proceed downstairs to the living room or go to the left and walk straight ahead. At the end, turn left into my studio. There are 2 possible realities in this one drawing. The small abstract collage made of black, red, white paper shown to the right here again, there are 2 realities within the same frame. The lone sphere in the opening on the right seems unaware that just around the white ball there's another opening. The same idea of 2 realities shown in a realistic work can be translated into an abstract work. In the fall semester of 1978, I was a graduate student in the University of Iowa City, visiting artist, Stanley Lewis, a professor of painting from Kansas City Art Institute, came in for a few days. His means of organizing space, his quick rendering of charcoal lines in his drawings, immediately got my oops, let's see, let's go back. There we go. Stanley Lewis on the far right. Okay, in his drawings in the far left, there's a case of reverse perspective. Usually the foreground, which is nearest the viewer, is presented as a place that is clearest, but the reverse is true here. The background is in focus. Here in my drawing on the right, the main character of the work is the drawing itself. Sometimes an artist will use drawing as a method of exploring ideas for a final work that will end up being a painting in oils. With this work of mine on the right, the drawing is a final expression. At times I think I've become less interested in making finished, perfect, contrived lines. And maybe I'm more adept at making use of the lines created out of my intuitions and emotions of the moment. So I just let the spontaneous, quickly drawn lines seemingly crass lines live on the page. My use of color was strongly influenced by the Sunday morning cartoons, or the funny papers, as they are often called. As a youngster, I would spread the comics out on the living room floor. In the image on the right is my acrylic painting, Acadian Woman, which is an example showing my preference for overripe, intense color. Brenda Starr, red hair, sparkly eyes, and strong character demanded respect in a man's world. She insisted upon taking charge of hard-hitting news assignments in the newsroom of The Flash. Another redhead was Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, a favorite childhood story of mine. When you look at the photographs of people, we want to know what's taking place in the photograph. Then we compare it to what we know now of these people. George was proud of a recent accomplishment of mine. I'd received an NEA grant in 1982. I was giddy with delight. We were playful with each other. My art is autobiographical. Here I show the monthly ritual of cutting hair. It was always difficult for him at first, this giving in to having his hair cut, and it took a bit of coaxing. But when he finally did, he'd be overcome and he'd melt into the chair. Leon Rappaport and George collaborated for many years on articles and on authored books about the Jews and the Holocaust. They would meet regularly in the living room of our house. As I worked in my studio, I could hear them talking together downstairs. They'd knock off around late afternoon, and Leon would stay on for a shot of bourbon. I joined them downstairs, not for a drink, but to hear of their excitement over their work. Even though I was there physically, I felt isolated. I could tell that they appreciated my presence, my interests, but none of their questions and ideas were directed at me. But this often happens in groups where 2 or 3 people emerge as the primary speakers and others are listeners. I made this a theme in my Snooks Jazz series of paintings. In the painting The Owl and the Pecker, I portrayed between them, sealed up in what looked like one of my chapel box paintings from Greek myths and contemporary chapel boxes, It's All Greek to Me series. In the photograph on the right, we 3 are caught equally excited by a common experience and a bike ride in the back roads of Kansas. George and I love to travel aimlessly along unpaved roads of Kansas, both of us together on his Honda 390. George was always looking for a good place to photograph. Sometimes he would want to return to the same spot that seemed promising, but where he hoped for light or clouds to be different from how they were when we were first there. I'd take a sketchbook along and settle down not far from him with a felt-tip pen in hand and sketch him photographing. He would sometimes turn the camera on me without my noticing. This is one of those times. My photograph was taken in the Garden of Eden, Lucas, Kansas. This is a special place in the hearts of many Kansas artists and non-artists as well. When Dinsmore was a man of 81, a bit of a cynic, he married a young thing of 20 years old. He started to build a home 2 decades before they got married, out of limestone cut to make the structure look like a log cabin. He requested that he be buried there on the site in a mausoleum that he built. Today, Dinsmore, lying in state, can be seen through a glass covered over his concrete coffin. His plan was that others would make money off the viewing of his corpse by charging money to pay for a viewing. He thought people could not be relied on to do things from decency, rather one had to bribe them to do things. My photograph on the left shows a man dressed as a soldier of the American Civil War, and his wife follows behind him. She has her bag of belongings behind him. He shoots down a squirrel, which is about to attack a smaller animal. I saw the Garden of Eden sometime in the early 70s. 2 figures appear in my print, Bath, I completed in 1982. These 2 awkward, unrefined figures in my print, Bath, are similar to Dinsmore's figure in style. They struggled to get the daily bath ritual accomplished, proving that intimacy is too much in close quarters. In 15th century Northern Renaissance wedding portraits, there would very likely be a little dog sitting next to the couple, an emblem of fidelity. In my take of a wedding portrait, I placed a small dog near the couple. The title of this drawing is Couple Embracing. In the print below the garden, the couple is not embracing, but there is nevertheless a sense of closeness. With the National Endowment for the Arts grant in 1982, I was able to produce this print and 15 others working with the printer Mike Sims. I was able to produce this print out of his Lawrence Lithography Workshop in Lawrence, Kansas. They form a suite titled Dreams and Memories. Mike Sims is someone who truly deserves to be called a master printer. Humans are often given nicknames to distinguish themselves with animal characteristics. We should be able to recognize correctly types in the animal world, such as a sly fox and a busy beaver. In my portrait painting titled Enigma with Red Glove, there are established types that begin to diminish the boundary between human and beast. This beautiful lady with one green quilted female breast and a reptilian belly is very sad. She's unaware how beautiful she is. A second portrait titled Turkey Buzzard, shown on the right, has a proud head aloft on its tall phallic neck, which is implanted in the shoulders of a human. In my photograph of a tiny Chinese man with his huge pet dog, they are so wrapped up in each other in play, they almost become one. I completed a series of watercolor collages titled China Journal, an East-West theme based on my 6-month stay in China in 2006. I never thought of myself as a watercolorist. When I asked the question, how does Margo work? Nowhere do the answers include the use of watercolor. My way of working in the studio includes quick, spontaneous attacks on the canvas using oil. I would have to soften the attacks if I used watercolor. With watercolor, my work habits would all too quickly become precious, and I would tighten up. When I work, I expect to be able to scrub the area of an already painted area and go back and change my mind frequently. I want a surface that'll keep up with me, have endurance. I prefer not to be always in control, but instead to follow what seems to be happening on the surface. So watercolor is not my medium of choice. Therefore, just to prove something to myself, I decided to focus on that medium once and for all. In 1991, I received money from the Kansas Arts Commission for a project using strong, tough, 6-foot wide watercolor paper. I did some experimentation on small portions of the paper, 11 inches by 14 inches paper, which became watercolors of interiors of the house, as well as some studies of the Kansa Prairie. These paintings are a little more than pretty little painted exercises. They were too safe and needed more impact. I stored them away. While I was in China for 6 months, I collected discarded papers that I found left on table, on benches, or little clippings from Chinese advertisements, clipped from unwanted magazines and newspapers that had been tossed away. Back home in Kansas, I introduced these found Chinese papers to my watercolors. To this painting, titled Hero, I pasted the lone, nearly nude Chinese male figure. I had cut out out of a male underwear ad. There he was, rising up from the Kansa Prairie like a maypole in the sky. The watercolor became alive. It had been disturbed. It was now more real and immediate. This is how Margo the artist works. Artists are not all the same, even though we're all artists. This series of watercolor paintings took 14 years from the beginning as watercolor sketches to their final stage. I point this out to demonstrate how unpredictable art can be in terms of how much time and how many directions something might take before it becomes something of worth. In the photograph below, George turned the camera on me when I thought he was photographing something else. I'm in a pose similar to that of the Chinese male figure standing tall on the Kansa landscape. There's a common thrust to both works. Jan Olnick, a woodworker in Manhattan. Jan here? Yeah, here's Samantha. Okay. Designed and built this folding screen for me. I knew nothing of it until it arrived one day. It had these large metal hinges down the centerfold of the screen that seemed to visually dominate everything. So I gave in to the hinges and allowed them to take prominence in a position as art as well as practical use. By allowing the hinges to seem more like hooks on a robe, I portrayed my father in his ministerial robe became a real possibility. When I studied the plywood and its texture and grain, it seemed to me there should be two strips about 4 inches wide that dropped down straight from the top of the screen and on either side of the centerfold of the screen. At that point, I decided not to gesso these strips or on either side of the centerfold of the screen, but to leave the plywood exposed. This allowed the strips of wood to represent strips of velvet fabric that would have circled around my father's neck and continued down the front of his robe. This folding screen is titled Vestment and has words on the back. And these are scripted by Tony Chills. He's here. Yeah. Here's Sterben, wer ich zum Leben. Auf Werdestein. Ah ja, auf Werdestein wärst du. Thank you, George. Okay. And so, okay. Die I shall, and so as to live. Rise again. Yes, again you will. Mahler's Symphony No. 2, Resurrection Symphony, Final Chorus. On the far left is a photograph of me taken by my father when I was 3 years old. In the summer of 1997, I traveled to Greece for my own odyssey around the island. I rented a car and I went up into the Peloponnese and circled around the mainland, going into Greek villages, Tripoli, Pylos, Kalamata, Argos, Patra, Aegio. Later, these names of villages became titles of my Greek chapel box paintings. There are chapel boxes everywhere, along the roads, near the coastline, and even in the center of parking lots. I learned that chapel boxes were there to invoke a saint as a patron of a particular town. These were by no means small boxes. They could be up to 8 feet tall. There were no standard design for the shrines, instead they were made of found objects and came straight from the heart. I felt an attraction to these works. They reminded me of what I felt toward the religious icons in the cemetery I had seen as a child when we were living in Texas near the Rio Grande. Working with these images, I first aimed at developing warm and cool colors on the canvas. The succeeding chapel boxes ended up being something like self-portraits, and they reflected segments of my autobiography. It made no difference to me whether an image that came to my mind was actually present in a particular small shrine in Greece. I felt free to use whatever images had been suggested to me in my mind by what I saw, and this freed me from having to illustrate a storyline. The images could interrupt each other, much like thoughts that might suggest themselves as one took an afternoon walk down the street. Various stimuli might trigger some unrelated thoughts, ones that seem true only to the person who has them. I call this lateral thinking. Another influence in my thinking had to do with postmodern art. I have been sitting in on a class given by David Kataforis, a professor of art history at the University of Kansas. I learned of the influence of postmodern art in the work of various artists today. This has had some bearing on my work as well. I remember my visit in 2003 to the Picasso Museum in Paris, how fascinated I was with a particular work titled The Remains of the Minotaur in a Harlequin Costume. Picasso had combined two separate styles of mark making with the same drawing. I knew that he had not done this just to be silly, so I looked closely. Then I noticed that on the right, he had established a classical line. It's very classical, very simple, very. To represent the magnitude of the Minotaur. On the left side of the drawing, he embellished lines to convey a sense of the lesser beings in the story. My study of that work allowed me to go ahead with something similar in my painting. Chapel box Aegio, one on the left. When I was at work on this painting, shown here on the left, there came a time when I stepped back to have a look, it looked unfinished, as if part of it was still in the drawing stage and not a complete painting. The work appeared unresolved. The deliberate incompleteness in the painting makes tangible the fact that as time passes, the chapel box is aging, crumbling. On a trip to Japan in 2006, I had a chance to see Japanese folding screens with asymmetrical, jagged, but nevertheless majestic, beautiful lone trees with painted on gold leaf backgrounds. They made quite an impact on me and my work. When I returned to the studio, several hours of work on a new chapel box painting titled Al Mal de Dia, I stepped back for a look. The painting looked very similar to the one of the folding screens I'd seen in Japan. My first thought was, I have to change that. It should be a Greek influence, not Japanese. Even though the effect was derivative, I left the painting as it was. My Greek chapel box series of 19 paintings has taken me a period of 1997 to 2011, about 14 years, and I have 3 more to complete. This 7th century bone sphinx with amber face inspired a self-portrait. The Lacanian style identifies this object as Greek. Therefore, I placed the painting in my series of chapel box paintings. With this work, I wanted to illustrate the fact that I do not copy the works of other artists. I steal their ideas. Okay. Whenever I begin a new series of works, I challenge myself to investigate new things. With this work, I wanted to see if I could get my lines to be not so flat. Instead, appeared to be thrust out into space. I was looking for motion. This painting had the look of a baseball player in full swing. It's about a human in motion. I titled it "Get Cracking Night Game." I watched the Kansas City Royals play the San Francisco Giants this last fall in the World Series and found the contorted arm swings of the pitchers pretty amazing. I was able to construct these arching, long, sweeping lines with Roplex house paint. I purchased from a paint store in Lincoln, Nebraska. It had great body and good covering power. The paint was runny, enough so that I could get it to wiggle down in different directions. If I rolled the canvas after each application and let it dry overnight, a stroke would end up moving upward against gravity. None of the lines on the canvas flowed in the same direction, which would usually be expected. I resist the idea of having a single, easy, identifiable style. If I were to concentrate on style, I would quickly find my work becoming contrived. It would lack the freedom to evolve and become something I'd never had intended in the first place. When I come to a point when there's something that is not working in the rest of the painting, I'll work on a title for the work, and the title can help to make clear my intent. It becomes a guide as I move ahead within the work. The title of this work is Seeds, a medley of 40 small paintings. These paintings were inspired by a summer trip in 1986 to the parts of various ranch lands in Kansas to examine wildflowers growing month by month in successive waves across the prairie. I've never considered myself a landscape artist, but one day I decided to make my own unique style of landscape. A Kansas Arts Commission grant in 1986 provided me an opportunity to collaborate with Mike Sims in his Lawrence Lithography workshop for one day to produce 8 monotypes titled Land I Love. This series of prints turned out to be as close to a landscape as I could produce. They are portraits of little wild critters that inhabit the vast lands of Kansas. This is, one example is a monotype shown here on the left of a prairie dog, titled Dog of the Prairie. And it wasn't until about 2 years ago that I pulled the work out and had a fresh look. It did not take me long to bring these prints around to looking something like I'd experienced out on the prairie. They became portraits of prairie dog, a coyote, a spider mite, and with the use of pastels here and there, I was able to bring a sense of clarity and explicitness to the overall appearance of these creatures in nature. The works now shown in the screen were done in the same year. They seem to be the same orientation. My choice of the spider mite, so small a creature, does not necessarily represent sweetness and beauty in a landscape. It can be destructive to plants. The coyote, usually depicted as a trickster, acts as a free agent who questions social conventions through deception and humor. The seed is an embryonic plant. It is a symbol of beginning and maybe hope. Humans beings enjoy summer baseball games out in the nightly air. This portrait I did of a visiting watercolor artist, a professor from Norwich, England, who was in Kansas State University Art Department teaching for the summer in 1991. He requested that the class paint him as he posed one day. I was sitting in on the class and I joined in. He talked the whole time about how much he missed his family and his home in Norwich and the Norwich school where he taught. Later I took the watercolor I had made of the professor and pasted across his body a clipping from an illustrated story of a Chinese traveler as he crossed a bridge over into a foreign town and remembers his family and misses them. There are moments when living in China, teaching at the Jilin College of Art in Changchun, when I miss my home in Kansas. In my photograph taken from my third-story apartment, I show two of my Chinese students on their way to painting class. At times, I return to some of my early works for ideas. At the bottom of this image, you can see the charcoal drawing I did of the backyard on Bertrand Street. I used the same view of the backyard. I did not trace over the drawing. Instead, I returned to the same spot on the backyard steps where I had sat doing the charcoal drawing, and now beginning anew with the same scene, this time in watercolor. I pasted a clipping of a proud young Chinese homemaker holding up her very clean dish. Her presence reinforces the East-West theme that I wanted to stress in these works. High in the trees, I placed a row of Mao Zedong heads, which allude to the high honor, respect the Chinese still have for Mao to this day. He is deified by being placed against the sky. There are 3 folding screens to represent 3 seasons: spring, evolving fishes; summer, grazing bison; fall, migrating monarchs. All are painted in 1998. The 4th season, winter, is not represented. I did not grow up knowing a winter. In southern Texas, I did not experience a really cold winter as a child. Therefore, the result of the matter is that there are 3 screens with 3 panels each, and the matter of consistency is in numbers. Okay. The multi-paneled screens of Korea, China, and Japan have been appreciated by people the world over since the 7th and 8th century. They have provided generations of artists with surfaces for scenes. Painted on high-quality materials such as gold, silver leaf, brilliant pigments, ideal physical supports. These folding screens reside nicely in a room, as a fan does against a human face. It can hide a secret, or it can be just simply beautiful. On the right is James Albert McNeill Whistler's folding screen titled Blue Silver Screen with Old Battersea Bridge. Whistler's charcoal sketches for this composition show that he simplifies the structure of the central bridge pier and aligns it to the center fold of the screen. This deceptively small bridge shape therefore swings gently toward the observer or away, depending on how the screen is bent, yet never loses its basic form. In my folding screen on the left, spring emerging fishes, my intent was that there be a folding screen perspective and an implied simultaneous passage of time and space in my 3-panel screen. This work borders on a kind of abstraction. The viewer sees the same swimming silver-leaf fish glistening in the water in each of the panels from 3 different angles. And simultaneously as a part of one overall design. This type of thinking is a fundamental principle underlying Cubism. The fish changes as it goes through different stages of biological development. At one point, its head appears not like a fish, but as the head of a parrot. There's an exceptional book called Folding Screens by Charles Hemming, who is an artist himself, which gives a fine account of folding screens from early time through the present. My folding screen to love Madrid is meant not to shield or hide, because both sides are equally available to us physically. The male matador on one side, the far left, and the female flamenco dancer on the other. The front, usually the more decorated, is referred to as recto. The back screen, where the decoration is simple, is referred to as verso. But this screen does not have a back side. It works best when it takes its place not along the wall of a room, but enjoys a space toward the room's center. The serpentine frame of the screen was brought to my mind as I watched a bullfight in Madrid in 2006. I watched a bull dance around the matador. I knew that certain movements of a bullfighter and the flamenco dancer deserved to be on a curved screen. The screen has overlays of all my impressions and memories of a well-loved city. Below the screens are 2 collages from tape series. The collage on the left is titled Matador. The one on the right is titled Coaxing the Line. This was an assignment I gave myself the summer of 1976. For the duration of this project, I decided I would use only adhesive tapes on white paper, 9 inches by 12 inches. I began to collect all kinds of adhesive tapes for different purposes, from tape for shaping a simple wet curl of hair on a woman's cheek to dry, tennis racket tape, floral tape, tape to put over a door to signify radiation inside, medical tape for my father-in-law, the dermatologist, duct tape, I love duct tape, library tape to seal off worn ends of books, and white metallic tape I found at Pearl's, the world's largest discount art displayer in Canal Street in New York City. Okay. So far, I've not been showing works in chronological order, but instead matching up different series to illustrate how one series relates to another. I began my talk by focusing on chronological succession, starting with a few childhood photographs and with subsequent early influences. In the remaining images that I will show now, I've worked the groupings of ideas and influences. I can be a risk taker in my art by using non-traditional art methods, materials. Taking risks is true in my life, too. Along with this comes a sense of mild panic. What if? But it comes out for the best. And my husband purchased for me electrical pencil eraser for me to use in my drawings. With this tool, I was able to create a blending and scattering of pastel lines. He would come up with these offbeat ideas for my work, a very supportive gesture on his part. In this drawing titled Signacore, on the left, done in 1976, there's a line so red hot that it appears to me to be electrically charged, a line that connects the top and bottom boxes, just as a spinal column connects and transmits information and commands from the head to the body. The work on the right is a painting done by the British artist Francis Bacon. It conveys what appears to me to be a frightened being. Bacon does not preach or tell us how to see his work. I was aware of Bacon's highly charged figures before I attempted my own drawing Sigma Corps, but only recently did I see something similar in these two drawings, two works. The umbrella works as kind of a claustrophobic cage that encloses the figure's head and separates it from its body. My painting titled Hera, Consumed by Jealousy at Zeus's Infidelity, one on the far left, which is 14 inches by 12 inches, was done in 2009. Hera was a very jealous wife who spent most of her time plotting revenge on the nymphs that were seduced by her husband, Zeus. Hera, shown on the left, is full of jealousy, and Zeus, standing on the right, tries to convince her that there are only two lovers. That's all. A couple lies between them, representing Zeus and one of his many mistresses. I ran across one of Edvard Munch's paintings, Jealousy, which offers an example of how another artist might portray extreme emotion. There is the color green in both works. As the saying goes, green with jealousy, the blind stare of the victim, and the guilty party totally involved in his passion. And the loss of a loved one is another extreme emotion that I thought had to be recorded. I began with a series of paintings, 4 birds, with the last painting of the birds series, which is called In the End. George was dying of emphysema at the time, a condition of the lungs. The bird in the painting is dying. The tip of his tail feathers cast a shadow, but his head does not. His head is already not of this world. He is letting go within an all-encompassing atmosphere of shattered space. And comparing it with Edvard Munch's painting titled Death Struggle, there are similarities in the sense of evolving circles of energy that fill the room. The wide-eyed woman in the far right looks out at us in fear and disbelief, as does a small bird in my painting. How curious one voice can speak out to another over time. My four-bird series of paintings is based on 4 stages of human life, from conception and birth to youth and innocence, to coupling, nurturing, to accomplishment, elation, and final to death. Munch's painting titled The Frieze of Life, woman is defined by phases of physical growth and maturation. Virgin youth is depicted as a woman clad in white in a dreamlike innocence, reaching out for a flower. A woman clad in scarlet dances in a rapturous oblivion as her hair wraps around the man. A woman clad in black, hands folded, belongs to a realm of darkness and age. I found of interest how closely our works paralleled each other in choice of color and pattern to stand in as metaphors for the multifarious emotions of joy and sorrow in various contexts within the work. My visualization of death may now live in my art, but I remain alive, not dead yet, and I predict many more paintings. So thank you for your attention and interest, and now I'll be glad to have your comments and hear your questions you might have. No? Okay.
It was really good to have you explain the way you did your interpretations of her.
Does it?
Really,
Okay.
it's really fun.
Thank you.
Because I've seen your work for all these years, and it's just to hear you.
Does it pull it together?
Yeah.
Good.
Explain everything. Just like, wow.
Because I remember once a shrink said to me, not my shrink, said, who are you? You do this, you do that. I mean, who? And I didn't know what to say, but then but now I could say something. I mean, no. Yeah. So that was Jan. made the screens. Okay. Maybe we took the talk.
Margo, have you, as you did this retrospective, were some of these paintings things you found in the thinking about it, or had you known them before? You know what I mean?
When I do a work, when I come to an idea, and is it something I've seen? Say it again.
So, as you did this retrospective, and you've shown us paintings and works, did you find these now as you were doing the retrospective, or were you conscious of them before?
I wasn't conscious of anything before. I mean, I did barely to know that I was on the right track. I knew that I may be scattered, but that's what I had to do. And then now, my God, it's just, yeah, and it's so clear, and I just was amazed, yeah. And I was glad I lived long enough. I'm 75, so I can, yeah, finally. Yeah, I know. Thank you, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Lou.
Mario,
Yes.
what's it like when you attack a camera? Are you the sparks fly, or are there, is it deliberative, or can you create the scene a little?
It's just what comes to mind, how if I were taking a photograph of myself or a movie, I said, that must be what I look like. I mean, that's what I feel. And it just, I like big brushes, and and then I may scrape it all off after it dries, or I might leave part of it there, and so that I like it so that I can, sometimes if it looks too pretty, too complete, then I have to throw something at it and like throw a wrench into it to make it not work, and then really then I have to dig back in and then make it work so it looks like it's been disrupted and abused. Or I don't, yeah. I like to move around back and forth, and I turn it around and turn it, and keep looking at it, and then what I do is I plan to paint on a day that I'm feeling good. I mean, I have already made my phone calls. I've already my assignments. Everything is done as well as it can be. I go down and then in the studio and I will work for 7 hours. 2 hours to have a noontime meal, and then I straight through, and I'll go and just sit and look at what I've done, and I look maybe for an hour, and all of a sudden I begin seeing that needs to be fixed. That's not right. But I didn't see all those things at the beginning, and then so that's when certain things, I know it needs something right there on that painting, and it may be a year later that I have a blue, the right blue, and I'm painting over here, and I'll turn around and I'll go like that, and it's done. Yeah, yeah.
Margo,
Yeah.
do you draw before you paint something? Do you ever?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depending on, if I'm drawing, then I'm going to have to get to know my subject, what's happening. But if it's like the picture, the baseball player, then I had all these paintings out in my yard, in the backyard, and they were all black, they were all painted black, and I had all this paint. You're not supposed to breathe it, it's toxic, really. He said, don't use it in your house. So, I mean, don't breathe it. So I just painted outside, and I loved it, because my lines were like this, flat. I tend to be a flat. I see things flat, and so I wanted to get something three-dimensional, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Margo, do you feel a compulsion to do something every day or every week, or just come and go?
But yes, I mean, working on this talk. I've not done any work in my studio for a year and a half. I mean, that's all I've done. And then, and I miss it. I go down, and it's the first time that my studio's been dead. It's totally dead. Usually I can go in and I say, oh, I need to finish that. Okay, as soon as you finish this, then you can do it. I mean, I have dialogue just walking through. And I'll be going to get some towels for upstairs. And then I'll, but it depends. Sometimes yes, I don't wait till I am inspired. My inspiration, I research things, I read. I don't tell my book club that because I told them I didn't read. But I like to listen to how they talk about the book. And anyway, and so I like to read. I mean, I'll read about like the chapel boxes. I got in touch with the Library of Congress, and I said, are there any books on chapel boxes? And they said no, and they couldn't give me any of them. And I thought, somebody should write something about that. But I just dig as deep as I can. And or the one with the face, it's a portrait of, just a little, the one I showed you, Chapel Box. I mean, it's part of the Chapel Box series. And it's, seeing that work as a photograph of somebody else's work, and then all of a sudden I thought that would make a great portrait. I mean, and so I steal it. I mean, yeah.
The chapel boxes, are they there as, when you drive in Mexico, you see memorials on the side of the road that are for people who have had unfortunate accidents, or they're memorialized on the side of the road with these shrines. Are those serving the same purpose?
No, they're for saints. In Greece, it's for the saints of the town. Every town has a saint.
Stop and pray at these different spots.
In Greece?
Yeah.
I never saw anybody praying. I never saw them vandalized, and that was significant for me. They would have a little Coke bottle, and that's where the oil was, and then they'd add oil to the lamps, and they would add things like paintings of the Christ on the cross, or some religious kind of background. But in Mexico, it's more, where someone's hurt themselves.
I'm going to suggest that we continue this conversation informally and let people there are some nice refreshments set out. And for those of you who are members of the Friends of the Beach Museum of Art, find Kelsey. She has drink tickets for you. She's wearing a white sweater. She's standing right outside the door. And so I suggest let's continue informally, and let's give Margo a big hand.